Pau.
¿Qué más? ¿Cómo va todo? ¿Están listos?
Sí, creo. Parece que estamos listos y emocionados.
Otra cosa, cuando el ponente hable, todos apagamos las cámaras, ¿correcto?
Yo creo que sí, porque tal vez alguien se queda, no sé, debería quedarse alguien como moderador. Yo igual voy a apagar mi cámara, ¿no? Solo me quedo ahí por si es que necesitan alguna cosa. Aunque ahorita, ¿cómo van a hacer con el tema de las preguntas y esto?
El Cristian va a hacer Pau, así es la agenda del día. La Ana va a introducir, viene Marcelo, después la Ana introduce a Neil, habla Neil, yo introduzco a Kyna, habla Kyna y Cristian es el moderador. Creo que quizás Cristian es el que tiene la cámara prendida.
Okay.
Hi, Kyna. Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
This is Kyna.
Hi.
Hello.
Kyna.
Kyna, it's great to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I wanted to introduce you to Cristian and Ana Maria and Paola, the four
Very
of
nice
us
to meet you
have
all.
been working together.
I'm a little early, but I sometimes I just wanted to make sure, because I'm using Keynote, that there's a video that you can hear it. So I do want to test it before we start.
Yes, we could do that right now.
Yeah.
That would be good.
Okay. Should I do that now, or you're gonna?
Yes.
Do you want to use? You're
Yes.
busy having. Okay, let me close some other things that I have open. And let's go here. All right.
Ahora ya hay 4 personas que están en el seminario, ¿no?
So I need the screen sharing.
Yeah.
And are you changing that?
Yes, I think it's ready.
Okay.
Yes, you can do it now.
Okay, it's still, okay, here we go.
Okay, yeah.
It says host disabled participant screen. So is it, can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Yes.
We are.
Okay, so I'm just gonna play this one to see if you hear the sound, because but I still have that message. Do you see that message on it, or is that just me who sees it?
We just see Kyna Leski, The Storm of Creativity, the cover.
And now you're seeing an animation?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because I see advanced sharing options, who can share, only host. Oh, there, okay, I got rid of it. So can you hear that?
No, I think you have to put shared sound.
I have to do what? Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can you say, repeat that?
Yeah, on the upper, I think on the upper options, you have to put share sound.
I don't have that as an option. The only option I have is who can share, only host, all panelists.
I know that when you put share screen,
okay,
then I think in the lower part, right part or left part, it says share sound.
No. This is what I've encountered before. Sometimes it usually does. It usually says that you can share to optimal for video, but it doesn't say that. I don't know. Yeah, it says all I have is who can share, host, panelists. And it's as if I was made a host, but because it's asking me to record or pause recording, which is odd.
But can you put share screen?
I am putting shared screen.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So if I click on the okay, oh, now I see what optimized for video clip. I'm seeing it now. So okay, so you should see my screen. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So now let's try it again. Let me bring it. Do you hear that?
Yes, we can hear it. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Works.
Okay, hopefully that will work for, whoa. Hopefully that will work for both videos that I have.
Thank
Okay.
you. Hi,
So
hi, Neil,
I stopped
welcome.
sharing, right? I can see you
Yes.
now. Okay, great.
Hi, Neil, welcome.
Hi. Hang on, I'm just now having my technical problems, but I'll be with you in a minute.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
The other question I have is that I never know, like there's two ways of sharing the Keynote. One is through, what I just did, which is you click on the screen that has it. Is that the way you guys do it with Keynote?
Okay.
Because there's the other way is to like start it playing. And that may have been the way that makes the sound automatic, but the only problem with that is that you lose control. Like you can't see anything, so you saw my full screen, correct? When I did that?
Yeah,
Okay.
we saw your computer basically.
So you are seeing the banner at the top.
Yeah.
Oh, that's not good. All right, so the other way of doing, there's another way of doing this.
I'm also thinking there's a way that you share your audio. Let me think.
I'm gonna try again and see what happens this time. This is strange. Oh. That's strange. Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Marcelo, welcome.
Thank you.
So you're seeing my whole computer, including the banner at the top?
Yes.
Not right now. Now?
Stop seeing it.
Do you see your faces on the side panel?
We see it on, we see your face on the right side panel.
And now you don't, right?
No.
Okay, that's what I'm gonna do. All right, okay.
All right. And Neil, we wanted to introduce you to Marcelo Banderas, who's our dean at the architecture school.
How do you do, all of you?
Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
Well, it's somehow exciting that we've all managed to arrive more or less on time. And I hope I won't have the same technical problems. I'm a complete innocent with this machinery.
It's always like.
And hi, Kyna. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes, you are.
Kyna.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you as well.
So I just noticed today's schedule that it's 20 minutes, not a half hour for each of us, our presentations. It has 20 minutes for the talking part of each of us have. 22 minutes.
No, but you can have an hour. It's
okay.
It's okay. Yeah,
okay.
Don't worry. Yeah. Somehow we arrange it for an hour and a half or 2 hours.
I'm just interested. The audience that we'll be talking to will be mostly students at what level?
So we have students that are entering the university at 18 years old and they're graduating at around 22, 23. But we had opened the seminar to everyone. So you would have students from the university, but as well professors and, open to the public. So it's a wide spectrum, I think.
Good.
And not all of them might be architects as well. So that's
I like talking to non-architects as well.
Yeah, that's why we wanted to have like multidisciplinary speakers to have like a different perspectives of drawing and how like we perceive the future through it. So That's why we decided to make it like that.
And this is the first in the sequence, in this format.
Yes, it's the first one.
Yeah, we've had an international forum at the school for about 25 years, which has been interesting, but it's an event which occurs only once a year.
Yeah.
And even with the pandemic, where it's on standby, because usually it's with guests that fly into Quito. Mm-hmm. And but we've been thinking for a long time about trying to get a lecture series itself, because lecture series are very particular in that they create energy in the school every week or every couple of weeks. So they have a different dynamic, and they're very important for especially in these times where many students are still locked away at their homes, that there's something that happens which is external from the sort of structure of the formal structure of the school. So that should be very important.
That's exciting. And how many of the students, what proportion of the students are still working from home?
We have right now, there's quite a bit. We had set up about 50% of students to be have their classes at the university, but in reality, I think it's only about 20%.
Right.
Because
and how had you selected the ones that were allowed to come back and the ones that couldn't?
It was the students themselves who chose.
Okay.
We were able to, because we had some hybrid classes which allowed students to be either at home or in the classroom, and so they selected whatever option they had chosen. But even though it seemed that they were a little more interested at first to go back to classroom and to studio, most of them have stayed at home.
And what do you think is going on there?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it has to do with the lack of the sort of physical classes. The presence of the physical classes isn't the same as it used to be, because there are so few students and everyone has to have a mask, and it feels a little mechanical. Mm-hmm. It's not as interactive or as natural as it could be. And so students initially, I think, were interested in it, but then a little bit of fatigue set in where they thought it was still a little more comfortable to stay at home. And so the university's thinking about going into a full present mode in January, as possibly the only way they think that it can become a reality again. Because if we still leave it sort of up to the students, it seems like they're a little more comfortable staying at home. So we'll see exactly what happens. But
that's an interesting question, which I hadn't seen coming.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see how that's going. Most of the three of us, or the three professors that are here, have been somehow involved in some at presence classes, right? Christian has some, right?
Yes, I do have some students in campus, but most of them, they have decided to stay at home.
But they're few, right? They're few. They're not that many.
Yes, well, it actually varies because they have the freedom to come and go whenever they want. So sometimes I have 3 students, sometimes I have 8, sometimes I have 12. So it really depends on the day, and also I suspect on their moods as well.
And do you, Christian, find that very confusing as a teacher?
Yes, sometimes it is, because it is quite easy to just focus your attention to those who are in the classroom. Yeah. And sometimes you tend to forget that you have, some other people, also listening, in their homes. So it is tricky. It really does require, for us to sort of divide our attention. It's several spaces, several dimensions at the same time.
Got it. No, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just interested because the range of problems in Europe and America is also extreme, but I think rather different.
Ecuador, I think, has been one of the countries that has changed the most in the recent in the recent weeks because of the whole system of inoculation that has been very positive to Ecuador. So we're seeing drastic changes in the people behaviors themselves in the past weeks. And I think that that will be, it's like a foreshadowing of what might have coming up in the next few months. But we have been very closed up and very secure in our homes. So I think it's hard for most families to let go of that since it's been so long for us. And we also have a lot of students that are not from the city, but from abroad. And that also, I think it's an implication because their expenses rise when they come to the city. And obviously that is something to be, aware of. So I think we're almost on time to start.
Yeah, we can start, I think. Yeah?
Who's, Ana Maria is going to start, right?
Yeah, so yes, I'm going to give right now an introduction about the topic and how it started. And then Marcelo is going to give a few words. And then we'll start with Neil and continue with Kyna, if that's all right. Yes?
Very few words in my case.
Okay, great.
Very good.
So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So welcome everybody to Drawing the Future, Visions of Architectures to Come. After the crisis of World War II, experimental groups such as the Metabolist, Archigram, and Super Studio, among others, created architectural and urban visions of the future. Through drawing and the creation of architectural imagery, they found a way to explore and materialize their projections of the future through a highly expressive graphic language. The compositions took the two-dimensional principles of architectural drawing to propose three-dimensional, complex, and sophisticated realities. They were innovative in their social, urban, and cultural connotations, as well in their means of representation. In this manner, the architectural drawing became the privileged language to spread ideas and ideologies. Drawing is ubiquitous, not only in architecture, but also in other disciplines. The practices of urban planning, graphic, and textile design, fashion, and signage start with drawings in different scales, formats, and media. Therefore, drawing is inter, multi, and transdisciplinary, allowing architects, artists, and designers to speak the same language through many vocabularies and infinity versatility. The topic of this conference emerged with a conversation between Isabel, Paz, and me. We asked ourselves, what is the current role of drawing in the ideation of the future? With the infallible collaboration and constant guidance of Cristian Parreño, the support of Marcelo Banderas, Dean of the School of Architecture and Interior Design, and the whole university, we organized this series of conferences which purpose is to investigate the architectural drawing from historical, theoretical, and creative standpoints, highlighting the role of creativity in the ideation of what has not been seen. Today, we have two speakers, Niall Hobhouse and Kyna Leski. Please feel free to send any of the questions through the questions and answers window. We will review them after we finish all the conferences. We will start right now with Niall Hobhouse, and we wanted to welcome everybody to the first lecture, the series lecture of conferences of the Universidad San Francisco de Quito and the School of Architecture and Interior Design. Welcome to Drawing the Future, Visions of Architectures to Come. Now we're gonna hear some words from Marcelo, Dean of Architecture and Interior Design.
Thank you. It has been a year, I think, since we began talking with Cristian Parreño about the lecture series for the School of Architecture. And at the school, we've been very fortunate to have had an international forum every year for the last 25 years, a forum that has been organized by our great friend and colleague Diego Oleas. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, it has been paused briefly, we hope, and will soon begin again. Nevertheless, as the pandemic has made our social lives more introverted, it has opened new possibilities of interacting with a broad range of international scholars. With these virtual lectures, we hope to create an atmosphere at the School of Architecture of continuous interaction and inspiration that will occur every couple of weeks during the school year, so as to foster a continuous level of dialogue and exchange of ideas between our students and professors. I always remember when I was an undergrad in New York in the 1980s, that the Friday 6 p.m. lecture series would allow us to recover whatever energy we had exhausted during that week of classes. And for this particular event, considering that we hope that it will be the first of many lecture series to come, the initial question involved what would be the best theme for the lectures. And as we talked with Christian, it became more and more evident that if there is one fundamental act or activity that architects are engaged in from the first years of study to our lives as teachers and professionals, it would be the act of drawing, not only as a tool of graphic representation, but as a means by which ideas pass from the mind through the eyes and on to the hands. This act, which begins with an abstract intention, does not pass literally to the paper, but is filtered through a visual and tactile process in the drawing act itself. Nevertheless, as we will hear in these lectures, drawing may also be understood as a much broader condition of discovery through different formats, techniques, and expressions. It is from this notion of discovery, whether it implies the deconstruction of preconceived notions or ideas, to the awakening of the unconscious states of perception that we engage in during the design process, that I am convinced that we may draw inspirations from the fundamental acts of drawing itself. Therefore, thank you, Kyna and Niall, for accepting our invitation, and let the lecture series begin. Thank you.
First I want to introduce Niall. Niall Hobhouse collects drawings by architects. He curates exhibitions and writes about buildings, landscapes, and museums. In 2015, he established the Drawing Matter Trust to explore the role of drawing in architectural practice, architectural education, and exhibition. He is formerly a governor of the London School of Economics, chair of the advisory board and the city's program, trustee of the Sir John Soanes Museum, and of the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal. In addition, he's a lecturer and writer on architectural and curatorial issues in institutions such as the V&A, Architectural Association, Architectural Review, Economist, and Building Design. We are honored to have you, Niall, as our first panelist. Welcome.
Am I now on screen?
Yes, now that you can share your screen.
Okay, thank you both for that very generous introduction, and I liked very much Marcello's speculation on the role of drawing, and I think it might be interesting for me, or worthwhile, to try and explain a tiny bit more about what we do at Drawing Matter in the context of what I'm going to show you. I've actually enjoyed thinking about the topic of radical drawings, and in that context, I want to try and suggest that there's a different way, or there are other ways of looking at these images produced in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s that we can generate, that we have the opportunity to see by looking at them in an archival context or in the context of the archive itself. Strangely enough, Drawing Matter collects drawings, but not, this is an odd thing to say, not with a primary interest in drawing, but really in architecture. And I think what I mean by that is that I'm interested in what the drawings tell us about the process of design, and that it's these moments that emerge in the archive when the architecture and the drawing become almost the same thing that interest me most. So I have resisted collecting presentation material and resisted slightly collecting printed material, because I feel that there are insights into the work of the architects that one can derive from looking at very often the pencil marks on the page. That said, I conceive drawing as the word drawing as something very broad to encompass almost any media, certain kinds of model, photography, collage. And I think that the principle there, which is sometimes hard to demonstrate and articulate, is that a designer with an urgent or radical idea is almost bound to test the conventions and the equipment at his or her disposal in representing it. So you can say in a rather simplistic way that a good building very often actually produces a good drawing, that there is a correlation. Always keeping in mind the other principle on which we collect here, which is to try and think of drawing as a verb as much as a noun. That it's an activity, and it's the insight into the activity that we can generate in the archive. And I thought on that principle, it was probably quite good to talk to you from the archive itself. And I might just, I think rather than try and flip my screen, I'll just revolve the screen, and you can see that we're in quite a small room which contains an indeterminate number of drawings. One of the rules I have is that I never count what we've assembled here over the years, because I believe in a sense that the material, though we catalogue it fully, shouldn't be constrained by ideas about what a collection definitively is. And I think that the last point I would make as a general introduction is to say that many of the things that we do and that I'm interested in, we do to try and, how shall I say, fill the gaps that the institutions and institutional collectors are prevented from doing by their very nature. So, I mean, a very straightforward example of that is the cabinet of sketchbooks, which I showed you just in that quick pan there. Most of my colleagues in museums at MoMA or the CCA or the V&A, who I talk to all the time, say, oh, you know, we love sketchbooks, but we can only show one page at a time. They represent terrible conservation problems. So we're really happy to let you have them, Neil. And I have to say that from my point of view, that I see their limitations as my opportunity. What I'm going to do now is just share my screen. That is not where I want it to be. Here we go. Okay, is that coming up now? So I'm going to do a little survey for you, very, very quick, of mostly of material here in the collection, but not exclusively, and of one particular strand of radical architecture from just after the Second World War through to the early 1980s. I thought I would nevertheless start with this image because it makes for me an important point about, two important points about radical architecture. One is that this is Mies van der Rohe for the glass skyscraper project. The first point is that you can never divorce these very bold steps in architectural language from a political context. And what one needs to remember here is that this project was developed by Mies at the height of political instability in the Weimar Republic. The hyperinflation was just beginning. The French were about to invade the Ruhr. So there is a correlation, and you can't forget, never should forget the politics. The corollary, of course, is that in these moments, architects have rather less to do. So they're inclined to put on paper the wilder projects that they possibly haven't had time to do. In this case, the photograph is dedicated to Peter Behrens, which is in itself significant. He'd worked for Behrens until 1912, where at which point they'd had a row over a client. The Kröller-Müllers had first employed Behrens and then decided to employ his assistant Mies. It's very unclear from the language, the German, on the inscription to Behrens that whether Mies is saying, I'm dedicating this photograph to Behrens, without whom I could never have got to this point, or whether he's in a sense just cocking a snook at his old master. The other point about this drawing, or this collage, which has always interested me, is that we know from other research that Mies employed the set designers and set fabricators from the Berlin film studios, who had been making the clay models of the houses in Nosferatu and the Cabinet of Dr. Cagliari to generate these Williamine houses that were placed to the left and to the right of the building, and with the idea of demonstrating how radical the building is. So it's a small demonstration of the resourcefulness of an architect in seeking out new representational ideas in order to articulate a radical idea of his own. I'm just sorry, having, here we go. This is sort of a footnote before we begin on the real topic, but this is Alison and Peter Smithson in 1952 and makes again my point about the politics. This was part of their very, very bold submission for the Golden Lane competition in London, in an area just north of the city, which had been very, very badly bombed. One of the things that we discovered in researching this image when we acquired it, it's been very much reproduced, but we were lucky to find the original sheet, was that they had in fact used, to make a political point, they had in fact used an aerial photograph shot of Coventry, which was a city in the Midlands, almost completely destroyed by German bombs in 1944. They had used an image of Coventry 2 weeks after the bombing in order to collage their new idea of the city onto that. I think the other point worth making is that that this, however radical and surprising, this was a real project. They didn't win the competition, but they were proposing something which was always in their minds a real piece of architecture. And I think something that I feel often in this context is, and in a way it's a question that I'd like everybody to be thinking about today, is with this kind of very radical imagery, when is something an illustration? When is it driven by a real architectural ambition? And I think it's a distinction that we try to make when we're acquiring drawings for the collection. There's a sense in which I'd like to claim that all good architecture is quite radical, and that there's plenty of what we think of as radical architecture, which is neither radical nor very good. And one needs to keep making these tough distinctions. And again, I think it's the archival approach that offers the most insight into that. This sort of strand I'm going to explore. I'm going to talk really about Constant, Holline, Pickler, Superstudio, and OMA. I've chosen that partly because of the relative richness of the material we have here, but also because I think it illustrates my thesis better than looking, say, at the Metabolists or Archigram or Paolo Soleri. So you have to choose your radical intentions. I think the thematic link in all of this material is essentially about freedom. It's an attempt to, in a very trite way, I think that one could say that all of these projects are about reconciling Marxist principle with personal freedom and trying to find an architectural or a language of architecture that allows both to coexist. That would be my simple summary. It's certainly true of Constant, whose New Babylon project was driven by his politics, and by his extreme left-wing politics, he gave up, essentially he gave up painting to propose this very bold alternative, and remained very close to Guy Debord, and it remained part of the Situationist International through to 1961-62, when he abandoned New Babylon. This gives you some idea of the informality, if you like, of the material. I think it also points up a second theme that, apart from the politics, ripples through this strain of radical architecture, which is a very, very close proximity to what was going on at the radical end of the art world, particularly painting and sculpture at the same time. And I think that's more broadly than that. There's an interesting capacity for this material, or for the representational means that all of these architects deploy, to leak into other media. We'll see that with ONA and Superstudio. This is Debord, and in a sense is the source image for all of Constant's thinking about it's an image I'm sure you're all familiar with. I could really have begun the talk with it rather than dropped it in as a footnote to Constant. This is Jonah Friedman, who I'm sure you are all familiar with. Again, very politically driven in sort of Reconstruction Europe. This is an experimental model for of which we have two, for a project called Spatial City, which simply involved the suspension of all the new building above the existing city. I mean, that we have two models from the series here. Here are images which sadly I don't own. I think they're in the Getty, but what I think is important most of all about Constant is, and this is something which becomes increasingly true through the 50s and 60s, is that many of these architects had a very, very intense focus on whether the projects that they were proposing could actually work in practical terms. So it wasn't just about imagining something on a sheet of paper and putting it out there to the public. One of the extraordinary things about Jonah's sketchbook is that he was, and indeed about the models that we have, is that he was passionately interested in how the metal support, how the junctions on the metal support worked, what were the load-bearing capacities of this sort of floating infrastructure would actually work. This is just from his analysis of the Spatial City project. Moving on very slightly, this is Hans Hollein from an early sketchbook during his American tour, which is sort of seminal to the work, and is for me very interesting because one of the first sites that he was on a scholarship and he had a year, and the condition, as I understand it, of the scholarship grant was that he had to send a postcard to the scholarship trustees from every place in North America that was called Vienna. That was the only obligation he had to fulfill the terms of the scholarship. Where he goes immediately is to the Native American settlements in Utah and Arizona, and this provokes an extraordinary kind of strand of work to do with reimagining the city. So this is a straightforward topographical drawing, if you like, done on the spot. In the same sketchbook, you see him beginning to develop ideas of a contemporary version of a city of this kind, very early in the 60s, when he gets back to Vienna, he starts working with Walter Pichler, who and famously says that when they're collaborating, Pichler defines himself as a sculptor, but when they're collaborating, there really isn't a distinction to be made between their work as sculptors and their work as architects. Pichler extends this, both of them, in fact, extend these ideas into a very elaborate notion of an underground city, of which this is one of the most famous images. These projects actually never really developed into the very much more sort of publicly exposed material that you see, you will recognize from Constant, and from Super Studio. I think that was partly because as they were working on it, Hollein was very slowly building his practice as an architect. So the early shops in Vienna were happening more or less at this time as well. So that's another thing about radical architecture, is that it gets abandoned quite quickly when somebody actually commissions the designer to build something. Another example of whom, which I particularly love, this and comes directly out of this work of Hollein and Pichler. This is Ugo La Pietra, very early on, designing a house for a sculptor that was, in fact, in his imagining, to sit on top of a big 20-story residential block in Milan. This is the same Pichler, the same La Pietra, who goes on to develop a whole kind of narrative of, if you like, anti-architecture. He imagines a world in which everybody inhabits these inflated spheres, and communicates exclusively on the telephone and by looking at a television. This is radical stuff in 1972, and was part of his proposal for an important exhibition in New York called the New Domestic Landscape, which Emilio Ambas was commissioned to put on, and which brought Italian radicalism, essentially Archizoom, La Pietra, and Superstudio, to New York. Like many other things that MoMA did, it was supposed to be a great beginning and became sort of a tombstone, because it was immediately followed by the oil crisis and a sort of retraction in these sort of foreign contexts and foreign curiosity. This is La Pietra again, and you'll see echoes of many other people, including Hausrucker, in this project. I'm now going to move on to Superstudio, and to show you this image, which we're all, in some sense, depressingly familiar with. I made a resolution very early on when I started collecting Superstudio that I would try and avoid the finished collages. Most of all because, well, partly because they were very, very familiar and told one nothing new. The reason they were familiar was that the actual physical collages were always the final works for reproduction. And in a sense, less interesting from that point of view. And I was very keen to push behind these collective products, partly also because I was interested in the questions of authorship that they provoked. And I mean, you'll see what I mean by the following images, which come from Adolfo Natalini's sketchbook of this period, in which you see him trying to, if you like, compose the continuous monuments collage of New York, and running through many iterations, all in their way very powerful over a limited number of days. And that raised immediately questions for me about what the different roles of the various partners in Superstudio had been. And on inquiry, it became very clear that Natalini, who had been the tutor of most of the partners in Superstudio, took upon himself this job of composing or establishing the composition for the famous collages. You'll see in the same sketchbook that the continuous monument travels then in the sketchbook to India, to Graz, where they're working at the same time on a exhibition project, to Palazzo Ciacchiati in Vicenza, to Rome, to Florence. This was a series of collages that was in fact produced over about 5 or 6 years, but which was actually conceived in less than 3 weeks. Here he's in Rome, and then much more abstract compositions and furniture designs sort of dropped into the sequence. One of the authorship questions that arises is what was everybody else doing in the office? And this is a box that we have with all the unused Super Studio Collage material, which, how shall I say, projects the familiar image of Super Studio, which is of a lot of hipsters sitting around the office, tearing pages and reading fashionable magazines and tearing pages out of them. And they're arranged in these drawers by themes of landscapes, vehicles, people, and so on. One suddenly realizes that these endlessly reproduced collage products are in fact very complex productions. I'll show you this briefly, which was the very last continuous monument collage. And I made a sort of exception to my rule and acquired it for the collection, partly because it had never been reproduced, but also because I liked the story. What had happened here was that the monument had, in a way, done its job. It had been around the world, it had superannuated the role of the architect and, in a sense, of the city. It returns to Florence, its home city, to find that the city is, as it's described, a field of wheat. And there's nothing for it to do but to join itself up at either end of the Ponte Vecchio and to become, in effect, part of the Vasari corridor. So it's sort of an elegiac end to the Super Studio, to the continuous monument. Worth saying that many of the collages were actually developed for use in movies and not as single sheets. So that there's always this question of other media. Moving on now, I see I need to keep an eye on the time. Moving on now, this is, it's broadly called OMA. It's in fact Rem Koolhaas's graduation project from the AA, which he completed in 1972 in collaboration with his OMA partners. And again, it's a speculation about the liberty of humans. He'd taken as his reference the Berlin Wall and decided to create a walled off segment of London. The remark that I've always liked is that he was fascinated by West Berlin, which was described as free, but entirely, in fact, surrounded by East Germany. And this was the model. The drawing describes various zones of activity with living accommodation in these long ribbon blocks that extend out into the landscape. This is, I mean, another image, actually, again, in this case, borrowed from Hiroshima. This is a collage that has always entertained me because it didn't make it into the Rem's final cut because, as I understand it, he felt that the structure in the foreground came too close to Super Studio at just the point where he was trying to move OMA away from sort of self-conscious imitation of Super Studio. This is a detail of one of the public spaces, which, as you see, refers to all kinds of things that were going on in the more conventional architectural world at the same time. And this is a footnote, which is a huge volume of typewritten text annotated, which I see as the key to the whole project. It's been partly published over the years, but it's really just a reminder that the images that we all dwell on, and I'm sure you're familiar with, are only part of something, a much more complicated set of exchanges, which involves text and film very often in these cases. This is another footnote, but interesting, which is a model of the project, so that the yellow form you see on the left is Hyde Park, the one in the center at the top is Regent's Park. This is a set of photography of a lost model for the Exodus project. I'm nearly done. This is a kind of footnote, but really just to suggest that radical projects don't always have to be imaginary. This comes from Alvaro Caesar's sketchbook, where he is imagining this very, very significant, I think it's 12 or 1400 new houses in Evora in the Alentejo. This is a very, very early sketch where he's trying to work out how the housing blocks would work together, and the point here is to go back to my concern about always keeping the politics in mind. This is at the height of the Portuguese Revolution. He's working for a communist mayor in Malagueira, and the ambition is to make New City on a really significant scale that offers urban and spatial experience of the same quality as the Baroque city half a mile away. So there's, I suppose what I'm saying is that this one test of these radical ideas is that they are buildable. But I also thought it was nice to more or less end on a project that really was built and really did transform the way that public housing is understood. This is another Malagueira sketch, and then I'm simply going to end with something of a joke. This is the Boulet drawing for the tomb of Newton that you all know. This is a small drawing by Vaudoyer, who was a younger contemporary of Boulet's, which actually predates the Newton project, and which Vaudoyer was late in his life very anxious to claim was the source of the idea. At the top on the left, you see the Superstudio project for the Milan Triennale, and on the bottom left, you see Caesar's unbuilt half dome for the Malagueira project that I just showed you. So it's really this is really to indicate that radical ideas are not always as original as they seem. I don't know how long I've been, and I hope I haven't been too long, but is that, I mean, I'm very happy now to answer questions, or whether we should go straight on to Kyna's presentation. I don't know what everybody feels.
Thank you, Neil. I think the next we're gonna go on with Kyna, and then we will answer questions together between you and Kyna, and those questions will be held by Christian.
Good.
I loved your presentation and love the drawings, so thank you very much.
Excellent.
Anna, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Neil. That was extremely interesting and I think useful for everybody that's watching. Now we're going to start with Kyna, and Marisabel is going to introduce her.
I also wanted to thank Neil. I'm going to go along and introduce Kyna. Kyna is a journalist of dreams, animation artist, author, designer of buildings, bowls, and benches. Kyna Leski has dedicated her life work to the creative process. From a family of artists, designers, and architects, she witnessed process, the workings of intuition to design to building, the relationship of stated intentions to how others experience one's work, and the transgenic subjectivity between. These early ponderings unpinned her work as a student at the Cooper Union and Harvard's GSD, and her design, which was awarded in the Architectural League of New York's 1997 Young Architects Competition. In 1998, Leski's House of Visual Shadows, called Dream House, won first place in the Shinkin-Shusha Residential Design Competition. She is a principal with Chris Bart of 360 Architecture since its founding in 1997. Their work has been widely exhibited and has been published in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Leski's research into creative discovery has been fed and nourished by over 3 decades of teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design, where she is professor of architecture. She has served as the head of the Department of Architecture and head of RISD's European Honors Program in Rome. Kyna has given talks at the Korean National University in Seoul, the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, PopTech in Camden, Maine, and at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden. She's the author of The Storm of Creativity, published by the MIT Press and in 5 languages and paperback. Kyna Leski has been awarded a Lifetime Achievement by Design XRI, Design for Rhode Island, and was inducted into the Rhode Island Hall of Fame in 2017. Please welcome Kyna Leski. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna jump right in. Thank you everyone for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to hear your lecture and to engage in a conversation shortly. I'm going to jump right in, and I have a very different take. And everyone, I'm gonna put the play on. What do you see, Marissa? Do you see my screen?
Yes, we see your
screen. Okay. So I have a very different take. I think I don't see myself as a scholar. I do make many drawings of many kinds, animated drawings. I make drawings from life, drawings from imagination, drawings from memory, architectural drawings, design drawings, small thumbnail sketch diagrams, and have been taught to draw probably before I spoke from my father, who you will hear a little bit more about later. And as Marissa mentioned, I wrote this book called The Storm of Creativity, which is kind of the culmination of my teaching and the lessons I've learned along the way in watching many people, colleagues, my family, my students, people I work with, myself, projects going from the beginning from an intention, stated intention, and being revised by an emerging intention, and how it carries through to its manifestation in the world. And what I noticed was, I guess I sort of see myself as because I've seen so many projects go through these stages, I see myself almost like an early weatherman before there was meteorology, noticing patterns in this process. And I did what I do often, which is I draw to try and organize that information about, in this case, about the creative process and about discovery. So can you hear that? Marissa, can you hear that?
Yes.
We can
Okay,
hear.
great. So I did these drawings, this animation to try and understand how a creative intention arises with seemingly out of nothing after you've questioned everything that you thought you knew. But then it slowly gathers from the situation. And that gathering is energy that starts to propel it. So a new direction takes place. That starts this new problem that you define out of the workings of what you've done, starts to give it a direction with a momentum and purpose, which sometimes has to retreat upon itself, as you just saw there. But then it gathers enough density of intention that it needs to be manifested, and suddenly its consequences are, it's moving along its way to how it is manifested as a consequence, whether it's something that peters out very quickly or has big consequences. Sometimes those could be destructive consequences as well. And it's cyclical, it's contagious. You know, one creative work can lead to another. And some of them join bigger weather systems. I'm gonna just keep going. But I am now interested in other stages that precede the storm. And I'm working currently on this idea of a field, and shortly we'll be working on an idea of cloud. And in being invited to this conference about drawing and the role that drawing could play in terms of envisioning the future, there was one line in the brief that I think I focused on, which is highlighting the role of creativity in the ideation of what has not been seen yet. And so that is what I'm going to talk about through this lens of fields, because I think drawing, in my understanding of a field, drawing is a kind of field. That it is something that, if you think of this kind of field, it's something that it's very generative, and it is, as Francis Ponge said when writing about the meadow, said it's solid enough to oppose one's foot, but it's not that solid. It's something that is also very complex, part mineral, part animal, part vegetal. But I'm going to now think of the other ways in which we think of field when we talk about magnetic field, or the field that we enter, the discipline, that there's other properties that we use to define or to guide us towards using this word field. And I think they are really my definition of what a drawing is. And I do mean drawing the verb. And I don't define drawing based on technique, media, or whether it's 2D or 3D. But I think drawing is an act of holding together and making sense. It's also a place where invisible guests that are very important. That's why we change our mind. And that's why we make discoveries, these invisible, unexpected guests that appear. And that drawing is an act of paying attention, and what you pay attention to becomes the intention that is a kind of creative act. And so drawing, the way I understand it, and I think this all relates to this notion of field, is I see it through its etymological origin of to pull or to extract. And those are notions of moving towards and from something, drawing from the imagination or memory, or from the world through the author to the page. It's a bridge between the author and the world, between conscious and unconscious, between here and now. And in that way, it can start project towards there and then and have some way of anticipating the future. It propels design as it carries forward through its purposeful role as a language of expression and articulation of a thought. It also contains this sense of attraction, and in that way, it's so obviously a field. With this force of attraction inherent in drawing is also related to the act of tracing etymologically. Tracing and tracking and trait, they're all associated with track, which comes from the Latin root, the action of drawing along and the act of drawing. And in French, it's used to refer to the act of drawing, specifically a stroke in the delineation of a character. And it's related track to abstraction, which all drawings are abstract. It's just a matter of how much you take away, how much you edit, how much you include. Those choices are acts of abstraction. And so again, what I'm focusing on in my talk is a few examples of drawings, one from myself, one from my father, and one from a student, but through the lens of highlighting how the role of creativity in the ideation of what has not yet been seen. So the first idea about drawing and about field is how it holds together and how it makes sense. And to do that, I'm going to focus on activity I have done for several decades now, starting when I was in Rome, of drawing my dreams. And I drew my dreams because they were very vivid when I was living there. And I was given this sketchbook on my way to Rome. And I keep it by the side of my bed, and I wake up and I draw my dream, and then try to find some time later in the day to paint them with watercolors. And there's quite a collection of them. These are ones you see here are mostly the ones I did in Rome, and they really were a way of processing the day. But there was one drawing of a dream that the dream itself was very powerful. And to me, it is a way of highlighting this idea of what's to come, which started to play itself out many times with my dreams. I would have dreams, and I would make an image to remember the dream, and then I would find myself walking into the space of the dream after the fact. And so in this dream, it was that I walked out of the side door of the home I grew up in, and instead of there being the lawn, which was just the lawn, which we had, there was also these planting beds. But instead of having vegetables in the planting beds or flowers, there were these body parts. And these body parts they didn't upset me. They were very cleanly cut, severed parts of bodies. There were torsos, there was a brain, there was a rock border, there was a severed foot, there was a pelvis connected to a spine. And one of the things that was noteworthy about this is that for me was that there was a strange veiny pattern covering the torsos that you see there that I tried to depict. And there was a bat, but I wasn't sure where the bat was. So I just drew the bat, and then I remember erasing my drawing, and it just left crevices in the page. And so what you see now at the bottom is this just quick sketch of a brain with this pelvis and the spine, rising above it. And then what I did is what I always do, which is I just write a few words as a kind of title, "In My Father's Garden," and that was October 28th. And then a couple of days later, on October 30th at 9:30 a.m., I arrived at the Sistine Chapel for an appointment with Luigi Kolucci. He is a well-known restorer who was in charge of the 14-year restoration of the Sistine Chapel. And he had just completed the restoration of the vaulted ceiling and was beginning, and was, I think, more than beginning, was halfway through his completion of the restoration of the Last Judgment. Michelangelo's painted fresco on the altar wall. The Last Judgment depicts the story of the day of the Lord in Christian theology, the final and eternal judgment by God. It is told in Revelations through prophecy. It's an apocalyptic message that St. John received from Christ about the end of the world. And apocalypse is a Greek word meaning revelation, an unveiling of things not previously known, which could not be known apart from the unveiling. This end wall was covered with a tarp and probably like a 5-layered scaffolding. I met Kolucci and a colleague of mine and his wife on the ground floor of the chapel, and we started up a lift going through the scaffolding up to the uppermost level. It's a very tall space, as you probably know, and on the way up through the scaffolding, you got these glimpses of part parts of the fresco. So you could only see these parts of bodies as you moved up the lift. There were these slices of figures that were framed by the scaffolding as you moved up. And then we arrived at that top corner that you see on the right, where there's a cusp-shaped slice of vault pulled down in between the two walls, which is called a pendentive. And this pendentive is depicting the Brazen Serpent, a story from the Book of Numbers of the creation of Nehushtan, a sacred bronze snake. But from up close, one could view and see that the figures are enormous and distorted. You can actually start to see some elements of the snake wrapped around a staff and a hand gripping a snake. And this area, there's a shin that is well over a meter long. And he did those figures very large so that they would have, and they were distorted, so they would have so because of how they would be seen from below. But then I noticed this rectangle that was still covered with this dirty film. And I asked Kolucci, what's up with this rectangle that's still dirty? And he said that this is left that way as a specimen for future restorers. So as their techniques improve, they could still have an area that was untouched by the team. And then I noticed above the pendentive that there were these two bronze figures and that their torsos were covered with this kind of veiny pattern. So I asked Kolucci, what caused that veiny pattern? Because you don't see it everywhere. And he said that it came from water damage from the roof, which forms these microscopic tributaries to the surface, leaving a kind of crystalline white effervescence, which in prior restorations, they tried to make transparent by adding vegetable oils and animal glues to those areas with those veiny pattern. But it failed because the goo then collected dirt, and Kolucci, all he could do was clean away the dirt. And that damage from that you see of that veiny pattern was caused by saltpeter, which was in the mortar of between the tiles on the roof. And the saltpeter, it was made from bat guano. And at that point, I was struck by this sense of recognition that I was in this space before. And I was reminded of the dream that I had a couple of nights before. And what I had seen in my dream as a spinal column and pelvis looked like the staff with the bronze serpent held by a hand wrapped by a snake. The rock and the sand border looked like the painted border around the pendentives. The faceted corner composed of vault, pendentive, and side and end wall was similar to the skewed planting beds that were ahead of me and on my sides and behind me. And of course, the thin veiny pattern of the torsos in my dream looked like the thin veiny patterns of the bronze nudes. There was even a head of curly hair seen from behind that reminded me of the brain that I drew in my drawing of my dream. So I told my friends about this dream, and they were very uncomfortable. So we continued on our tour and started to climb down to the lower level of the Last Judgment. And I'm just going to move through this because we don't have that much time. But if you go down to the lower levels, you start to see these elements of the damned. And you see Sharon with the oar in hand on the left, manning a boat of the damned. And Minos stands in the bottom right corner, wrapped and bitten by a snake. A winged Lucifer chews on the ankle of one of the damned, and shown with a raking light, one can clearly see the engraved lines that were used to transfer these cartoons that Michelangelo made to the wall. And the large wing extends across the hull of a boat. And it's a wing that has claws at its tips. So I asked, what kind of bird has claws at the ends of its wings? And the reply was a bat. So I returned home and I looked at my painted sketch and I saw the engraved lines of my bat, and I decided to paint him back in since he was in the space I just entered. But I realized it was a kind of uncanny set of visual field notes of our visit, and specifically the close-up view of that upper corner pendentive. The the memory is more of a physical sensation of being in a space than a crystal clear photograph. But entering that upper west corner of the Sistine Chapel was like entering the space of my dream. So that kind of associative logic that one does in making a field that you say, this is what the project is, that one makes in the process of making a drawing, the verb, that associative logic that holds the whole together, that gathers the ideas, is so much at play in a dream. And in strange ways, it brings to light perhaps things that we experience that we didn't know we experienced because we're entering, or somehow we know. It's highlighting something that's to come that we didn't know that we knew, in terms of, in this case, entering the space of my dream after I dreamt it. So the other aspect that I wanted to talk about, because I'm trying to avoid methodologies, and I'm trying to avoid techniques in speaking about drawings, but really try and get to the heart of what the purpose is for the person who's making it, in terms of developing and arriving at an intention, an idea. You know, I do not believe you start a drawing with an idea. I think that if you do, it tends to be contrived, and hopefully you get sabotaged along the way and something else happens. You might start with an idea, but it can be derailed. So and that gets derailed by the unexpected and invisible guests. And this makes me think of this great quote by Czesław Miłosz, the Polish-American poet. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open, there are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. So this idea of invisible guests, I'm going to try and illuminate through a story about my father, who was an architect. He was the right hand of Wallace K. Harrison, of Harrison and Brownwitz, and he worked on many projects and did many kinds of drawings, from sketch ideas and perspective sketches to more finished presentation drawings. And he was the designer of the Opera House for Wallace K. Harrison in Lincoln Center in New York. And there's a story around this project because the push from the client and from Harrison was to make this more classical. And my father was of another generation and was enamored with Le Corbusier and was trying to move this into the next century as the new center of culture for New York. And this kind of pivotal moment that centers around this chandelier that is one of these iconic things in New York City. And you'll find them in the lobbies, but you also find them in the auditorium. And it came about from an appearance of an unexpected guest, in this case, an accident. And I'm going to show you this little clip from a film that was made recently. My father never really got credit for the work he did as a designer for Wallace K. Harrison. But when they did a film, the director Susan Fromke did this film on the Opera House. They found this story about my dad, and there's a chapter on him that hopefully you can hear this.
One day, my father very characteristically is making a sketch, mixed media, grabbing anything that's in front of him, and not only of conceiving of a design, but then quickly visualizing it. So he's drawing it in order to communicate to others for a meeting. And in the process of adding some finishing touches with paint, a splat happened on his perspective, and there was no time to really start over again because it was just before a meeting.
All these paint splashed on the drawing and created some quite nice elements back in the middle of the drawing, like fireworks, you know. Well, Harrison came and said, "What did you do now? Rockefeller is waiting, Bing is waiting, everyone is waiting. Gosh, what shall we do now?"
So he quickly added some lines so that splotch of white paint could be refracted light from the chandelier. My father was nervous about that because Rockefeller and Harrison both were thinking that they would get a traditional design for a chandelier, and this clearly was something else.
And when I brought this, Rockefeller looked, and big also said, well, it looks very nice. Well, I said, that's what, but it isn't this white. Don't look at these white spots and so on. Look only at the drawing behind them. And I said, no, we are talking about that. Is it possible to do something like that? And the person looked at me, and I said, yes, of course we could do something.
There's a reason why everybody went, even though they had other intentions. My father's intention was not to splash across the page. Harrison's intention was to respect Rockefeller's intention, which was to do a traditional chandelier. But they all went, there's something that is shared that's just in the air. And suddenly it started to assert itself as not just an accident, but as something that could be the beginning, the birth, the genesis of the design.
And so this accident of the paint splat was what was the force behind this sketch of a definitely not a traditional chandelier that is rises just before the curtain rises on the performance beginning of an opera. But the interesting thing about this, which I think perhaps is behind this kind of consensus that magically happened between all the parties that were there at the meeting, is that there was this debate going on in the scientific community about the origin of the universe. And because of the radio telescope, you could suddenly see cosmic microwave background, which was the first physical evidence of the Big Bang. So that turned the scientific community towards saying that that theory of the origin of the universe was credible with this physical evidence, which you could see. And this was in the news at the time. And so that kind of seeing this as a moment of new culture, new moment in science, and this kind of turning the page in the science were all happened simultaneously. So the other thing that I want to talk about, and somehow I lost a slide, but is about intention and attention. And it's connected to this painting, which is also an unexpected visitor by the Russian painter Ilya Repin. It's made up of glances. And it's the role of glances which really have a signature to them. They take information, but they also convey information about the person who's doing the glancing. And this painting was used by the scientist Yarbus to study eye movements. And he found, he had this crazy device that he put on people's eyeballs as they looked at this painting. And he studied, there's 3 pages here that you see, he studied on the left 7 different subjects looking at the same painting at the same time or in a short period of time after each other. The middle one is one subject viewing the painting over time, like one day, a week later, a month later, etc. And then the right page is when that one subject is then asked questions. And so not only did he find that each individual has a kind of signature way of looking at things, but he also found that the role of the question like dramatically changes the way you look and pay attention. And that's something that I know from teaching drawing. There is this project that is a problem exercise that is a classic one called the blind contour, where you only look and you draw, not looking at the page, but you only look at what it is that you're drawing from life. And you try to record your observation and to develop this kind of hand-eye connection and flow. And what I found is that people really do have a signature way of looking that is revealed and heightened in a heightened way through this exercise. And so the word intention and attention actually share the same root of tendere, to stretch towards, to stretch the mind towards. And so I think what you pay attention to is really the core seed of this intention, which is the creative moment of a work. And it's very personal. It's something that I think it is subjective, and it is an individual way. And this is, I'm going to just now show you one last project, which is by a student in a class. And this, what you're looking at now, is the syllabus that I decided. Our syllabi have become more and more burdened over the years, and pages of legalistic stuff. So I decided this was going to be my syllabus. And there was no project given. There was just a site and a kind of sense about of purpose that just comes from that site. The site is the global shoreline. And the project was just to do something that in some way is cited on the global shoreline that wraps around the entire globe, because this is clearly, you know, ground zero for the environmental crisis. And I give the students a project to make a scalable line that is physical, and brought up this puzzle about how long is Great Britain's coastline. And of course, depending on the scale of the size of the increment that you're using to measure, it can be, you know, fairly measurable, or it could become close to being infinite. If you start to measure around every single twist and turn or every pebble, the length gets longer and longer. So one student, Edward Caitlin, he had some object that he dipped in liquid, and that was his way of responding to that line around the globe. And then he developed it by then taking pages of paper that he dipped in this solution of water and charcoal. But each time he dipped the paper, he bent it in a different way. And so that it was the same thing as revealing the contours of this three-dimensional object, but now brought to the page and in these increments. And then he was kind of stuck. And I remember saying, oh, come on, Edward, just make something that is in the river, just stick something in the water, go into that pile of stuff that we have collected, of recycle, you know, stuff that we found. You know, there was this discarded fishermen's nets and water bottles in the recycling bin. And so he skewered the nets of 2 different sizes with the water bottles and I said, you have to make something you can stand on that will be afloat. And he made it in that afternoon. So he made something, it's a very smart way of making a float, because those water bottles can be empty and they support you, or they could be filled with fluid and start to be anchored down. And then of course, it was clear he had to make a net. So he started studying, how do you make a net? So he made a net. And then he started in this conversation mentioning that his grandmother taught him how to crochet. So I said, well, then you should crochet. And he initially didn't take that seriously, but I know enough from watching students and people work on projects that there's these significant moments that do have to do with your autobiography that come out of the blue. And that was that one where he mentioned his grandmother teaching him how to crochet. So he came back with this device, and that you could knit a cord. And from that, he could make a rope that can make a net. But in the meantime, we were studying about the crisis of the shoreline, and specifically estuaries that are dependent upon this kind of eelgrass to exist. And the eelgrass is easily destroyed, especially by invasive species of swan. And there's no way of cultivating it. We spoke to some leading environmentalists, and currently the best way is to tie baby rhizome eelgrass plants to cages that you then sink. Well, Edward came up with this idea of using that device that makes a rope, but putting in seeds of the eelgrass and then immersing it in water to see if the eelgrass would grow, which it did. And so the idea was that he could create a net of this impregnated material that could then be laid on the shoreline and could hold the eelgrass seeds until they sprouted and took over, and eventually the material, whether it's cotton or wool, would dissolve away. Well, he had this idea of using hemp because it had the perfect density and pliability to make this rope. And then we said, you know, you should stick it in water. So he got a tank of ocean water, and he was crocheting these forms, these hyperbolic forms that crocheting tends to make because the circumference keeps growing. And he found it had a center that could be anchored to weigh down these cores that could connect to the net that grew the eelgrass. And then when he stuck it in the water, he found out that it turned to a rock within like 20 minutes. Now, neither of us knew this, but the basis of hempcrete is hemp plus water and lime, which is what you find in ocean water. So it's the perfect formula for making this kind of anchoring habitat for growing eelgrass. Which brings me to this quote by Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. And I think that is where I stand in terms of this act of drawing and envisioning the future, that it's what we do is, at best, is make sense, primarily through this associative logic and through paying attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyna. That was lovely. And it's very nice to see the contrast of both visions of drawing between you and Neil. And I had to say that I just listening to your voice, because we couldn't see you, I remember the way that you taught me. So it was really nice to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will give the floor to Christian, who will be conducting the next series of questions and answers. So thank you again.
Thank you, Kyna, and thank you, Neil. I think that there are very interesting topics to be further explored. We have two questions from the audience. Question number one, I suspect is for both Kyna and Neil. And Mauricio Lopez says, a recurrent question from my new students each semester is, why should I learn to draw if there are already computers?
I have an answer. I think, Marcello, you said something about the drawing being the idea of being brought from the mind to the eye to the hand. And I actually think it happens more often the other way. And it led me to a book by a friend now, the neurologist Frank R. Wilson, who wrote a book called The Hand, where he basically, he's retired now, but he's a practicing neurologist who treated people who use their hands, whether they were pianists or jugglers or artists. And they all developed problems that they weren't the physical problems of the hands. They were more of a neurological problem. But he saw that the hand pushes around the mind much more than the other way around. And even in evolutionary theory, that is true. Like when we stopped using our hands to move is when we developed language. And so anyway, so I think, even when I'm talking, I'm going like this. So the reason is because we're thinking through them. And this idea of the invisible guests of participating in the world, it's, there is another that comes, sort of plays itself out with material. It doesn't do everything we want it to do. And that kind of participation of the world comes through material and through making. So that's my answer to that one.
And thank you, Kyna. That was a lovely answer, actually. And I'm not sure that I can improve on it beyond, in a sense, just reminding everybody that architecture for 800 years or 600 years has always adopted these new tools for representation over enthusiastically. And the computer is in a certain sense no different. The biggest problem with it was that it was understood very, very quickly to be something that saved everybody a lot of time because it could do that. What I see increasingly is people, practitioners, trying to reintroduce the speculative element of drawing into their digital practice. So that in a way, all that I think happened was that it was over enthusiastically adopted, and now everybody is thinking again about what the real process of creative design is.
Thank you. Here is another question for Niall, and someone is wondering about the scale model behind you, the open hand monument, and they're wondering if it's an original or what kind of piece.
Okay. No, it is the one of a group of models that were made by Corbusier for the open hand. Actually, in this particular case, we know for the iteration, the original iteration at Chandigarh, I would say, I think I did say that I hesitate to collect models because they represent mostly a very fixed moment in a creative process. In this particular case, I made an exception because it is in plaster. It was clearly a part of a speculation which involved a group of other models which are very well documented. So one can identify its role in the process. Listen, I'm in a very funny position of having to apologize for having something by Le Corbusier sitting in the archive, but the short answer is that I felt that the model was implicated in the process of design. The actual materials of the model informed Corbusier about how it should look, and those moments always interest me.
Thank you, Niall. To Kyna, what do you think of Carl Jung's art theory? Synchronicity, unconscious, the spirit of the times. Have they affected your work?
Most definitely. I mean, actually, the story about the dream and the visit to the Sistine Chapel, there's a section in, I mean, I wrote that out, but I didn't read it today because it would take too much time. But there's a section in it about Carl Jung's synchronicity. Yeah, clearly he has affected what I do and my work. And I neglected to say something about the last project, which, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary what he did with the eelgrass, because, I mean, he basically tackled a problem that no one has known how to, I mean, he's still working on it. No one has been able to tackle. And in doing that, he's kind of created this drawing around the world, right? It potentially could be something that is crocheted and knitted by communities all along the shoreline of the entire globe. Like locally, this could be done to sort of, well, to protect the shoreline. And, you know, so there's so many aspects to this awareness that, you know, was there in the beginning, and this is related to actually the last question maybe, but that there's this awareness that we start with of the issues we want to take on, and then they're almost like forgotten, but then they come back through these ideas that arrive. So just when he said, my grandmother taught me how to crochet, was the portal to something which would do what I had asked them to do, which is to make a drawing, in essence, to work on this line that encompasses the whole world. And there's no way that you could start out with that as an intention. I mean, that's an impossible, you know, it's just far too big a problem to give anyone. But the portal was that moment of saying, my grandmother taught me to crochet. that's what opened up, you know, this kind of negative pressure of bringing in everything from his past. And, you know, it was the vehicle for carrying it was just, it's kind of, plus his grandmother lives on the water. So anyway, so yes, you nailed it. Carl Jung is very important to me.
Following that sort of biographical and psychoanalytical line, there is a question for Niall. And it is about finished drawings when you talked about Super Studio. Gabriela asks, I understood that something about architectural truth gets abandoned when it becomes a finished element. Could this truth lay in the necessity of the interaction between mind, eye, and hand? Is this process of drawing the only essential element for architecture to be conceived before it reaches a physical or real or obvious realm?
That's a very big question. I I'm sure that what you're responding to was my unease with presentation drawings. As somebody who's interested in architecture, on the whole, I find that we know what the buildings look like. And that the material that is offered to the client really really has none of the information that that tells one how the building was conceived and formed. Having said that, there are plenty of. I'm also wary of architecture that is only conceived as drawing, and I don't want anybody ever to think that a drawing is as good, is the final product. I mean, the question I always ask about a drawing is, what did he or she do it for? What was the intention behind the object? And I think that's what one has to keep in mind in any of these questions.
And
I mean, I'd very much like to hear what Kyna has to say about that too, if that's not.
The question, I mean, kind of went off the screen, so I can't.
Oh, sorry.
I can't see it anymore.
One question that perhaps, well, two questions that perhaps can be combined into one is one about how to push creativity through drawing. And also Martin asks how to be open to the invisible guest in a world where architecture is sadly more about anticipating inconveniences than working in the process and being open to the invisible guest. How we fight that status quo, perhaps through this notion of creativity through drawing.
My sense is that Kyna has offered us the answer to the invisible guests in the sense that it is about, if you like, remaining open to that possibility. As far as the question of in a sense, how should I say, what one, most of what we do here is about allowing students, when they come, to actually physically look at the drawings. We have very tough rules about not allowing more than around 10 people to come around a drawing at one time. But there's no substitute for the experience of turning over the pages in the sketchbook, which is would be my very practical answer to how to engage students with drawings. or for how students should engage with drawing.
I want to
I'm
answer the
talking
question.
always about other
Sorry.
people's drawings.
I want to answer Martin's question again, because we have a practice, and we have probably the most a wonderful building that we're working on now, but there's so many decisions, and you can see the automatic decisions that are being made constantly. Like, why are we doing this? Well, I could see the architect's lamp being chosen for the lobby. It's the tasteful architect's lamp. And, as soon as we're down into this realm of taste, I think we're in the status quo and convention. And we constantly have to, for me, I like making models that act as the brain of the project, that are kind of the field, the collector of the ideas and nothing more. This kind of stripped down model, usually small, that comes apart, that holds the ideas that came out of the process. And that's what I consult. And that's what I ask everyone to consult, because there is the tendency to have these automatic answers. And it isn't, I think being open is a lot of work. You don't arrive being open. I think being open comes from questioning what you're doing so much, that you have nothing on the page. And that nothing, and this is where the storm metaphor plays a role, the nothingness, this empty field that suddenly the smallest little tiniest thing, that grabs your attention is what starts this action of negative pressure of gathering a lot of stuff together. And that's where with Edward Caitlin, it was this moment of remembering his mother taught him how to crochet. So erasing everything, and to the point where you get stuck and you question everything, but then this little tiny beginning is a portal for the invisible guest. That little event is the invisible guest, and it brings with it a whole weather system. So I think you have to question a lot and be stuck in that moment of feeling shipwrecked, where the page is empty. Only then can you be open. Only then are you open to silly little ideas like crocheting.
For what it's worth, I could tell you my favorite invisible guest story, which is the architect Alvaro Caesar sitting in the courtyard of the Royal Academy in London, as he described it, in the rain, and he'd been asked to make an intervention in the courtyard that would transform the space. As he describes it, he wanted to make this series of 3 columns, one lying on the ground, but he couldn't get the scale right, and he couldn't work out how they would hold the attention of the viewer. And at precisely that moment of sort of defeat, a bright yellow DHL van turned off Piccadilly into the courtyard of the Royal Academy, and he realized that he could make if he made the concrete columns bright yellow, it would achieve what he wanted to achieve. And I think that actually that's sort of what architecture is about. It's about being open to those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Here I would like to interject a question of my own, which is about drawing as presentation or representation. Mm-hmm. So I think that Niall very clearly sort of explained us this historical moment in which architectural drawings began to change and being even sort of assumed as pieces of art in themselves. And I think that also Kyna has shown us that the act of drawing can not precede something, but is something. So it's not the representation of an architectural object, but it is architecture in itself. So I was wondering if both of you could perhaps, from your own points of view, help us to clarify this drawing as presentation, drawing as architecture, and or drawing as the representation of architecture?
If I turn my screen a little bit, I think you can see above the Corbusier model a big painting by Aldo Rossi, which in a sense states that problem very well. I'm not sure that Rossi actually had any interest in the buildings that he was designing after he'd finished the drawing. And that he's a sort of unique and uncomfortable case in the 1970s and 1980s, where this, where the drawn object assumes too much of the status of architecture. I guess I'm interested in a curious way in I'm more interested in this context in how he got to that very finished composition than I am curious enough in the object itself. And one of my sort of running battles is with the museums who like these big signature objects because they can be called finished, and in a sense, and are a way, very dangerous way, I think, of bringing the architecture into the exhibition space, so that people actually confuse the drawings with the buildings.
I mean, I have a brief answer, which is not much of an answer, because I have a feeling, Christian, that you can talk about this much better than I could. I was a student during, the peak of paper architecture in one of the schools where this was kind of the center of, which is the Cooper Union. And if I named all my professors, it would be very clear that, and so the value was of the conceptual rigor and the drawing being constructed as architecture was very much a part of my education. But I think now I use whatever is in front of me, and it's all about discovery for me. And I grab whatever. I don't even think about what it's called, to be quite honest. So I think you probably, I kind of forgot that question in a way. I don't want to do a disservice to your question, but I think it's no longer one that I've been thinking about, maybe because it's so much a part of who I am, but that it's not something that I am conscious of anymore.
But Kyna, do you feel that that's because you've changed, or the world has changed since you were sitting with John Haydock, as it were?
Well, John Haydock, like I remember seeing David Shapiro years after I graduated, and he said the only question he had for me was, "Are you building?" And that was the purpose. That's what he wanted to hear, that his students and Haydock's students are building. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, it's a different time. Yes to all of the above. I've changed. The world has changed. I mean, I don't even, like, I'm within, like, I consider what Ted Caitlin did with this crocheted bed of eelgrass. I consider that a drawing. That if you envision it as something that is wrapping around the entire globe as a line.
Could you also consider it as architecture? Yeah,
I guess certainly. I mean, it's changing the edge between, if we look at maps, the land maps have high tide as the edge, and the mariners map has low tide as the edge, right? There's this zone in between, and he is making that line, and he's playing with that. edge. I mean, what an edge, what a boundary, what a wall, what a, you know, a definer of worlds that edge is. And he's working on it. He's establishing it.
So would Drawing Matter consider having that piece, the crochet piece, as a drawing, as part of your archive?
I would love to consider it. It would create all kinds of conservatorial and issues. But yes, I mean, yes, it strikes me. I love that project, and it strikes me as being a drawing in every sense that we collect them.
You know, it's also, I have to say, I don't know how to reach him, because I've been trying to reach him for 3 years now. And I think he's, quite honestly, he was a student at Brown University and he graduated, but I think he is off trying to literally, I believe he's trying to develop this, and is.
I hope he's found a slightly faster way of crocheting.
Well, I think he has, but I think he could be very angry at me for making this public, but I've been trying to reach him, so that's his.
Okay, well, that's
his problem now. I've been trying to reach him because I've been trying to. There's been opportunities for, you know, grants and funding, but he hasn't responded. So maybe now he's reaching. I'm reaching him this way.
There is a question about the archive for Niall. This is from Mauricio, and he writes, doing architectural history research becomes a real problem when drawings and construction documents are unavailable or missing. Any advice on how to convince institutions, architectural firms, or practitioners not to discard those old papers, especially schematic designs, but also DDs, CDs, as-built, so on?
It's a big question, which is also very closely allied to how to convince the institutions to develop facilities for preserving them. In general, we in England, there are statutory protections which make it a requirement that a firm of architects keeps enough of the construction information, basically to defend themselves in a lawsuit. The problem there is that the material that one probably really wants to look at as a historian, the developmental sketches and so on, are the things that are almost inevitably destroyed. And there's a kind of semi-apocryphal story about Gordon Bunshaft at SOM in the 60s and early 70s, employing somebody to go round the design studio every evening to recover or to find anything that looked like a hand-drawn sketch and destroy it. Because his idea of SOM's practice is that it should project these fully fledged objects that had, in a sense, no process of gestation. So for the historians, everything is against us, really. And I think that the most important thing to remember, I would love to persuade people to keep more of their material, but the important thing to remember is that what we do see that ultimately ends up here or at the CCA is very often only a fragment and offers one a very, very partial view of what this process is. I think that creates imaginative challenges for the historians that can make the discourse of history more interesting. And so I think one has to work with the limitations rather than change the world. And don't get me started on digital files, because the problem there is not so much preserving the files themselves, but being able to access the software which will make them interpretable. I cheat a little bit by saying that I like 30 years to go by, and it gives me time to decide whether a practitioner's work really interests me. But it is also, of course, it is also becomes then an easy pretext for my not generally collecting digital files. We do collect occasional digital prints where they have been printed at a particular point for a particular purpose.
I love the story about Bonschaft, but also, I wonder, I know of other stories, of other situations where, with my father, I had a few scattered like shreds of Xeroxes to work off of for this making of this film. And, I was told that Abramovitz came through and threw out anything that Harrison's did when Avery, the archive at Columbia was made. It was sort of erasing his partner's, the more creative half of the firm's work. And most of those drawings were my father's. But also now at RISD, everything has been erased. All the work of, it's kind of has this memory, students teach each other. They carry, there's a kind of continuity that gets carried through from year to year to year. There's methods and techniques and everything that just, becomes the signature of the school. And there's no place for it. There is no archive. So we keep them in our offices, which have been basically like, not just, we've been evicted, but they've been destroyed. So with all the work in it. So there's a strange kind of psychology of different, motives to erase and control.
But keep in mind, that we may be part of the problem in insisting that drawings are verbs, not noun. The drawing is a verb, not a noun.
Yeah. How do you capture a verb?
How do you capture a verb? How do you preserve a verb?
Well, that's a very interesting question that perhaps goes back all the way to that sort of autobiographical and psychoanalytical aspect of drawing, which perhaps we can finish the session with one question that relates to that. To Kyna and to Niall, Eric Satie or Debussy?
I'm not answering that. I don't have an answer.
Or both.
I thought of Gorecki. I thought of my own composer.
For me, Satie always, but that's that may just be the moment of my upbringing and education, and my lack of empathy with earlier music.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kyna. Thank you, Niall. I think it's been a fantastic session with many open endings, which perhaps go back to the idea of drawing as creation and drawing as architecture, not just as representation of architecture.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Kyna. Thank you, Niall.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great to meet you.
Very much.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.